Turn your Bibles, if you will, to 1 Samuel chapter 30. 1 Samuel chapter 30. 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 8. 1 Samuel, Old Testament, chapter 30. Verse 8. And David inquired at the Lord, saying, shall I pursue after these troops? Shall I overtake them? And he, God, answered him, pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. I prayed, and the Lord heard my prayer. Topic: the Lord answers prayer. The Lord answers prayer. I prayed, and the Lord heard me. Prayer is in order, and we should pray without ceasing. This is a time in David's life where he's in a position where he's running for his life. Things are not going his way. God had anointed him king over Israel, but he's running for his life. All individuals that were following him, that were with him, were men who felt downtrodden, outcast. Those individuals whom life had failed them as well. And he had about 600 men that were with him for war. We'll find in the 29th chapter, he was asked not to be with his other warriors simply because he was an Israelite, whereby they were going into war, and the king thought that it would be a good idea for David and his men not to be with him. The idea was that, what if they changed their minds in the middle of battle and turn on us and become our enemy? Because this group of individuals had found a hiding place because they were running from King Saul. We find that these particular individuals, same individuals, now in the 30th chapter, have been out to war, and they are returning back home from war. And they're at Ziklag. We find that when they arrived home, the Amalekites had come and attacked their village, their home, their town, the coastal area, and had burned down Ziklag, had taken all the women, the children, captive. David and his men, when they arrived there at Ziklag, they found their families gone. In the world that we live in, there are so many things that happen to us that we fail to realize in so many different ways that other people are involved and other things are happening to other people, and we're not the only ones that are going through. Yeah. As men, when they arrived and found that their families were taken, they were so upset. They were so bothered He said that they cried until they had no more strength. David and his men were crying, upset, because of what had happened to their families. You can only imagine that here it is that they're out fighting in war, thinking that back at home everything is fine. The problem was that the Amalekites also knew that David and his men were out fighting. And unlike God, we can only be in one place at a time. But that doesn't mean that because we're not there, that God's not protecting and looking out for us. And just because we wind up in a difficult situation does not mean that God don't have us in the palm of his hands. In fact, Jesus told us in his word that if any man be in my hands, no man can pluck him out. I thank God because there are sometimes my situations get so difficult till I feel like I'm all by myself. The Amalekites came and they attacked Ziklag and they took the women and the children captive. David is here and he's emotional. His people, his men are emotional. They're crying and they just came from war and they're wore out and they can't come back home and refresh themselves and enjoy themselves with their families because their families have been taken captive. David and his men were at war. David and his men came home. David and his men were both upset. David and his men's wives and children were captured. David's men knew where David was. David's men knew that David was with them. David's men knew that David was a warrior. But in the midst of all that hurt and pain, David's men decided they would turn on David. They decided they would turn on David and they wanted to stone him because of what had happened to them. If we're not careful, we'll blame someone else for something that life has done. If we're not careful, we'll want to hang someone else out for something that life has brought. Because if I had not been at war with you, David, I'd have been home with my family. And I'd have been able to defend my wife and my children. And so it's better off for us if we stone him. David, meanwhile, being a man after God's own heart, sent for the priests, asked the priest to bring the ephraim. The ephraim is what the priest wears when he's praying and making sacrifices unto God. The ephraim is what he wears when he's seeking God's favor. He asked him to bring it with him. And then David began to pray unto the Lord. And this prayer that David prayed unto the Lord, the way that Scripture has it, it says that, and David inquired at the Lord. In other words, sometimes in the midst of our situations, sometimes in the midst of our battles, sometimes in the midst of things going on in our lives, we need to inquire at the Lord. Sometimes before we pick up a weapon, sometimes before we make a loan decision, sometimes before we decide to sign divorce papers, sometimes before we decide to make a purchase, we need to inquire at the Lord. Sometimes before we set our children down to have a conversation, Sometimes before we determine whether they're right or wrong, we need to inquire at the Lord. And so what David did, rather than to move from emotions, David inquired at the Lord. Rather than to go on what he thought should happen, David inquired at the Lord. Rather than call somebody else up, put him in the midst of his affairs, David inquired at the Lord. Rather than call in a committee and ask the committee to take over, David inquired at the Lord. And when he inquired at the Lord, he says what he said. Shall I pursue after these troops? In other words, Lord, you know what they've done. Lord, you know how the men feel. Lord, you know what the emotions that are going on inside of the camp. Lord, you know the hurt and the pain, the anguish that we have. Lord, you know all of my anxieties. But shall I pursue after these troops? What he was saying was, before I move out, before I take the first step, can you imagine what it would have been like if you had prayed to God before you got into trouble? Can you imagine what it would have been like if you had, watch this, prayed to God and asked him for his direction before you got into that relationship? Can you imagine what it would have been like if you had gotten with God before you made that purchase? David here is asking God, shall I pursue after these troops? In other words, I know what I want to do. I understand what my friends and my warriors want to do. But we're not going to move until you say move. We're not going to react until you say react. Shall I pursue after these troops? And then he didn't stop there, because see, the thing I want to understand is sometimes we ask God, but we don't ask God in the fullness of what the request is. And so what David said, should I pursue after these troops? And then he wanted to know, shall I overtake them? Here's what he's saying. If I get that brand new car, am I going to be able to pay for it? If I get into that relationship, is it within your will? If I go to this job and leave the job that I have, is it a part of your promise in my life? What David said, watch this, should I pursue after these troops? And then he wanted to know, shall I overtake them? What David was saying is, just going after them is one thing. Just going to battle is one thing. But whether or not I'm going to overtake them, I'm going to win, is something totally else. And so what David was saying is, I don't want to move until I'm for certain that I'm doing exactly what you want me to do. Shall I overtake them? Am I going to be able to accomplish? Watch this. Am I going to be able to complete? Am I going to be able to do? That's what you've called me to do. And here's what he said. And he answered him, God answered him, pursue. See, the thing, if you had known that God wanted you to stand still, would you have stopped? If you had known before you got in your situation that God had said, don't do it, would you have stopped? If you had known that God said stay, would you have stayed? Because God said stay. Well, David waited for God's answer because he prayed. See, the thing I want to understand is, I thank God because God answers prayer. And when he said, shall I pursue? And God answered him and said, pursue. David wasn't done though. Because David wanted to know is, David wanted to know for thou shalt surely, this is what God said, for thou shalt surely overtake them. In other words, I'm gonna win because God said I would. Yeah. These particular individuals were warring against the Israelites, and they were individuals that God had allowed to live to war against the Israelites. See, y'all hear what I'm saying? See, your enemies, God allows them to live to keep you on the right path. Y'all looking at me strange. Don't you understand that turning his back on Jesus betrayed him? Don't you understand that? Well, when he began to betray Jesus, Jesus said, "For this cause was he born." And so therefore, some people are born into this world just to make sure that you stay on the right path. Some situations come before you just to make sure that you stay on the right path. There's some things that happens in your life just to make sure that you stay on the right path. There's some difficulties that come upon you to make sure that you stay on the right path. There's some storms that come up in your life to make sure that you stay on the right path. There's some no's that you get to make sure that you stay on the right path. There's some situations in life that you have to go through just to make sure that you stay on the right path. Because given the choice, we'll falter. And so here it is. The Amalekites, those individuals were the ones that had attacked Israel. The first one attacked Israel when they came out of Egypt. These particular individuals, Canaan was about an 11-day journey from Egypt. But the Amalekites stopped them from traveling that way. They could have arrived at the land of promise about 11 days after they left with all of those thousands or perhaps millions of people. But they could not go that route because the Amalekites would not allow them. The Amalekites, those individuals, it is said that their name itself in some instances means stop the flow. Stop the flow. Stop the flow. Stop the flow of Israel from flowing into the land of promise. Stop the flow of Israel from getting to the land of milk and honey. Stop the flow of Israel from getting to God's promise. Stop the flow of Israel from getting to where God wants them to be. Because see, what God did was God allowed the Amalekites to send them a different way. Because watch this. Because Israel was out of Egypt, but Egypt was still in Israel. And so what God was doing was God was growing up a nation there in the wilderness whereby when they went into the land of promise, there were individuals that would serve him. See, the thing that we need to understand is what God is doing for us is, watch this, things happen in our lives and we're forever running from issues, trials, daily downsets. And God is saying that, watch this, when you go through this storm, you're getting ready for the next storm. When you go through that storm, making you ready for the next storm. And when you get through that storm, on the other side of that storm is your blessing. And the problem that we have is we never get past the first storm. So watch this. The Amalekites were an enemy of the Israelites. And these particular individuals, listen to who they were now. These particular individuals were the grandson of Esau, children. In other words, the children that they were warring against was Jacob's children. The one that were the Amalekites was Esau's grandson's children. In other words, it was part of Esau's line. Y'all do understand that Jacob and Esau were twin brothers. And so therefore, they were warring even inside of their mother's womb. And so here it is, Jacob got Esau's blessing because Esau was born first. And so sometimes things last a long time. Sometimes things go through from generation to generation. Listen, they stayed in Egypt over 430 years. And here it is now, the Amalekites, which is Esau's descendants, are now the ones that warring against Jacob's descendants. And so here it was this. Here's where they lived at. They lived south of Canaan between Mount Sinai and Egypt. Right there at the path that the Israelites had to travel to get to where God wanted them to be. Don't you know that God knew that they were already there? Don't you know that God knew that they were already there, having a desire to war against Israel? The situations in your life, God's not surprised of what you're going through. God's not surprised at your enemy's attacks. God's not surprised at the individuals that come against you. God's not surprised at the wars that come against you day and night. It doesn't surprise God. These particular individuals was placed there, right there in the path of Canaan in the land of promise. Egypt in the land of promise. And they were placed there, and they stopped the Israelites from taking the short direction in to the land of promise. And they had to take the long way around. If he had not sent me problems, I wouldn't be on my knees for him to solve them. And because I was on my knees for him to solve them, it kept me in contact with him through prayer. And I prayed to him each day, which means I got to know him to better. I watched how he took me from one day to the next. And because I watched how he took me from one day to the next, I learned how to trust in him even more, because I understood that if he brought me through that storm, he'll bring me through this storm, and he'll bring me through that storm, and he'll get me to where he wants me to be. But I've learned how to lean and depend on him. These were not the original individuals or tribes that were there when Abram first went into Egypt, because they didn't exist until after Esau. And so therefore, they weren't a part of the original tribes. These Amalekites were the first one to attack the Israelites. They were the individuals that had a desire to take them out. And so they continued to war against them. God had already given them information, had given them the information and the desire and the will and the power to take out all of the Amalekites. And watch this. And here's what he told Saul: kill every one of them. Every baby, every child, every woman, every man, every animal that they have, kill them all. And y'all know that Saul did not kill them all. And so because Saul allowed them to live, here they are now still attacking God's people. And because they're still attacking God's people, David here is now asking, watch this, he asks the Lord, should I go after them? And if I go after them, shall I catch up with them? And if I catch up with them, shall I overtake them? Watch this. And if I overtake them, can I recover all? Here's what God is saying to you today. Watch this. I know that, watch this, you've been through a whole lot. But I promise you, through my word, that you will recover all. David left and he went after them. And after he chased after them with 600 men, it said he got to a brook with 600 warriors. That's why I don't falter when everybody don't go with me. He got there with 600 warriors. That's why I don't fall apart when everybody don't want to be a part of it. He got there with 600 warriors. And when he got to the brook with 600 warriors, there was 200 of them that was too tired and too weary, too weak to carry on. And so what he did was he left them there at the brook, look at God Almighty, with their stuff, crossed over the brook with 400 men. And when he crossed over the brook with 400 men, God always sends somebody to help you along your way. God always sends somebody to give you all the advice that you need. As they crossed over the brook, they found an Egyptian wandering around. And when they found the Egyptian wandering around, they brought him into the camp and began to ask him who he was. He told them he was a young Egyptian, a young man who was a servant of one of the Amalekites. In other words, a slave of one of the Amalekites. And the reason why I'm out here, because about 3 days ago, I fell sick. And when I fell sick, my master left me. Watch this. We were the ones that had attacked Ziklag, and we fought Ziklag 3 days ago. And now here we, watch this, and now they've gone on farther and left me because I'm sick. And what David did was, God always know how to work things out. What David did was, David gave him some water, David gave him some food, David gave him some raisins, David fed him up, and then his spirit came back up in him. And when the spirit came back in him, then what David told him was, God Almighty, show us where they are. See, what he asked him was, you know where they are, you know where they were going, show us where they are. And what he said was, promise me. This is a young Egyptian that they found that was a slave. Promise me that you're not going to kill me when I tell you. And promise me that you're not going to give me back to my master when I tell you. And watch this. And what David did was, David promised him that he was not going to kill him. Promised him he was not going to give him back to his master. And he told them where they were. David found them late in the evening. Y'all are hearing what I'm saying? That twilight one evening, David attacked them and fought them all night, way until the next day. And watch this. And David, what good God Almighty, conquered them there in that valley. And said 400 young men riding camels was the only one that escaped. That was a part of the Amalekites. And what David did was he took everything back that God had promised him that he would have. Y'all hear what I'm saying? What God told him was, good God Almighty, David said, if I pursue God's word, God Almighty, will I catch him? And God said, you'll catch him. If I pursue and I catch him, will I get my stuff back? God said you'll get it back. Good God Almighty. Here's what God is telling us today is, don't get all upset at the folk that don't want to take part. Don't get all upset at the folk that don't want to go over the brook. Don't get all upset because, good God Almighty, those who didn't want to, was too weak. Let me do this. During Corona, they lost a loved one. During Corona, they lost a job. During Corona, they lost momentum. During Corona, they lost faith. During Corona, they lost participation. During Corona, they started doubting themselves, and now they're stopped. In Park. Don't spend your time upset with somebody who stayed at the brook. What God is saying to you is, go on into battle, because you're not the one that's fighting anyway. God's fighting our battles.